So let's start. So thank you guys for coming out. And I'm going to try and not make this as dry as my last one. So if you have any questions, don't hesitate to stop me. Let's do some interactive stuff. That would be great. So when we talk about cardiovascular, the goals of the concept, we're talking about cardiovascular training. That's all I focus on. To be clear, I focus on cardiovascular specifically. And it's really the balance. And the balance is between understanding how and when to have high stress and high recovery. My former coach, who was the 1980-1984 Olympic cycling coach for the United States, always told me in his heavy Polish accent, you must train hard, you must rest harder. Never understood the concept until I started putting data behind it. Then it made sense, because when you see how big differences change and then performance shoots up, then you understand. I was talking to the other group before, and one of the things that I said about this particular type of training, Vanderbilt, when they went to the NCAA championship, we were training at 20 hours a week. We dropped that to 11 hours a week, and we were still getting those results. So think about that. If you have that much extra time, what you can do. So let's continue. We're looking at specifically biometric feedback from the athletes, specifically heart rate, right? So, and I'm looking mostly at heart rate during training sessions when we're doing cardiovascular work, and I'm also looking at overnight resting heart rate scenarios. So I track both of those simultaneously. So that gives us an idea on making decisions on whether we play an athlete or not. Are they prepared for the match coming up? Is there illness coming on? Because you could predict illness from overnight heart rate scenarios, right? And then we'll discuss heart rate training and how it's used to assess readiness. And then we're going to understand and discuss the benefits of heart rate. And are our players getting fitter or not? How do we know, other than they look like they're getting fitter? Is a player becoming overtrained? Does anybody know what overtraining is? Anybody ever hear of overtraining? One person in the entire room? Two people. Oh, that's good. Overtraining is essentially they're tired and, right, they can't recover. And you don't want that in a scenario when you're playing match to match, particularly in tournament play. You want to be able to recover within 24 hours. Detecting illness and possible prevention of illness. And remind me to share a good story about that and how it relates. Briefly discuss and understand the data and how to draw your own conclusions as a coach on where your team is, right? And then leave you with something tangible. There's actual training. I put up a training thing that you could take a picture of for like basic maintenance over the summer. So you give your athlete something to go home with and say, hey, try and focus on this. And then, so what is heart rate training really? Well, really, it's cardiovascular training, right? Conditioning the heart muscle for performance, and it all starts with the heart. There is nothing that can occur in this world in terms of sports from tennis. You can't pick up a racket, you can't hit a tennis ball without a heartbeat. And until that changes, the heart is the most important muscle in my book for athletic and human performance. If you can condition this correctly, the heart becomes the barometer for the body. And it gives us the ability to jump higher, go longer, right? So just here's some quick stats on the heart. At 75 beats per minute, it's about 180,000 times per minute or per day your heart beats. It's kind of a incredible statistic when you think about that. 39 million times per year. Each heart rate is about 70 milliliters of blood. The average person is 5.2, but the average elite athlete is as high as 20 to 25 milliliters of blood. It's incredible. That translates into 2.6 millions of gallons of blood per year per individual. That's all of us, right? Why is blood so important? Does anybody know from a human performance stand? Anybody?
Moves oxygen around.
Yes. Same thing. So did you hear what they said? Oxygen. Oxygen is the key. Oxygen helps athletes perform greater, longer stress, whatever. That's why cardiovascular training becomes really important. So the key concept here is cardiovascular training is really about conditioning and training the heart for max performance. All the other aspects, I will argue, all the other aspects of any sport will get better if the heart is in peak condition. You guys know what blood flow is the key, but do you know who I work with this year? NC State, working with NC State. One of the interesting things is they're starting to peak from a cardiovascular standpoint, and I'll show you how I know from the data. And this is how, when we were 6 months ago talking about what do we want to peak for? Do we want to peak for the ACCs or do we want to peak for national championships? National championships is always the goal. Icing on the cake was winning the ACCs. Okay, so can anybody guess what some benefits of using heart rate training? Anybody? Yes, where did that come from? Well done. Anybody else? Yeah, but there's more tangible things that they can use. Can you help on this one? Recovery. Excellent. Yeah. Anybody else? All right, we're just going to move because I can't. We can sit here all day and do this. Tracking and avoiding and preventing and minimizing illness. Right? So I am suggesting to you, and I will show you data that verifies this, if you're tracking overnight heart rates correctly, you will see illness and you might catch it 2 or 3 days in advance before it actually hits. So what does that mean from a coach? What do you do with that? What does that help you do? Yeah, or get that athlete to student health, right? It shrinks the time that athlete is off the court, right? So you could actually be preventative to some degree. Tracking and recovering overtraining. So overtraining is what we talked about a little bit earlier, meaning the athlete hasn't recovered properly. So we could see that through the data the next day, and then it can make a decision on how hard we push that athlete. And that's, we'll get to it, but it's called intensity modification, which is what I do for the teams right now. And there it is, daily intensity management. So when I see the data come through, I get to the coaches, I send them a message every single morning on their team and say, either everyone looks great or back off on this athlete, push this athlete. I do percentages and everything. So we're constantly modifying the intensity. We don't change what the athletes are doing. We don't change what the training plan is. We don't change what you guys do on the court. We just modify the intensity to make sure that they'll be recovered by the next day. So it's not changing anything. It's just looking at it a little bit differently and making a little bit of adjustments. And then helps develop a more appropriate tapering or training volume. Does anybody do periodization here with your athletes? You do? You do? Yeah, what I'm suggesting is what I just told you. If you do that daily, augment every day, you really don't have to do periodization. You could do a tapering scenario when you're coming into a major tournament, right? Which is what we did with Paul Jubb when he won the NCAA championship a few years back. After the SECs, we gave him 5 days off of absolutely nothing, and then we slowly built him up, and the lowest heart rate he ever registered was on the last day of his final match, which was 39 beats, by the way. It's incredibly low, incredibly fit. He was getting fitter as the tournament went on, and usually it's the other way around. Usually athletes are getting tired, right? Let's continue.
I got a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
What do you mean by daily intensity management?
Like, so when I see something,
As a court, or like
no.
how many balls they're hitting per rep?
No. When I see, when data comes in overnight, let's say it's unusually high for some reason. Like, because I have baseline on all the athletes. So the overnight data comes in, like say 10 beats above where they should be. I'll get to the coach and say, look, so-and-so looks tired or seems tired. Back off a little bit on them. In other words, they could still hit and they could still do the things that you would normally do as a coach. Just don't do it with high intensity. Just back off the intensity. And you could use a heart rate monitor to do that. In fact, Jeff Navallo, he's now at SMU, but he would bring out, he's got a whole system, but he brings it out and he looks on the go, okay, back off. Like he's actually watching it in real time and he's saying, all right, slow down. You know, and we make these assessments. That's a little bit over the top, but it can be done without that. You don't necessarily need it, but that's when does that make sense? Okay, anybody else have any questions on that? Okay, training optimization. Did I mention that about Vanderbilt to you guys? We went from 20 hours a week to 11 hours a week. It was because we were able to optimize. So when I do a workout scenario, Raleigh, how long were our workouts? About
30 minutes.
max, right? And that started with what? 10 to 15 minutes, and then on the back end?
8 to 10 minute cool down.
Right, so you're only talking maybe 10 minutes of actual work twice a week to elicit results. So you could shrink the amount of time. Vanderbilt stopped running completely, other than what they did on the court. Everything is on bikes. The same thing with NC State. They don't run. They just run on the court. So everything cardiovascular speaking is on bikes, stationary bikes. So through a VO2 max testing, it allows individualization of training. So I train in a group scenario, and I don't want to lose you guys on this, so if this gets a little bit out there, stop me. But do you guys understand the concept of zone training? Does anybody, so what is it? Tell me. I want to make sure you know this.
Training within certain ranges of heart rate.
Right.
Certain results.
Right. Okay. Excellent. So he's talking about different zones and heart rates, right? From the VO2 max test, I use biometric markers during the test and set up specific zones. That's how I get the I use 5 zones. I color coordinate those zones. Every athlete has different numbers associated with those zones. Okay? By training by color, I can condition what that particular individual athlete needs, as well as another athlete. Or what you have and what I have and what he has are all 3 different sets of numbers, but our colors will be the same. So you could train to the individual in a group scenario. That allows this to be effective. And then we usually do it on stationary bikes. But you can do it other ways. That's not the end-all, end-all. So why is this important for tennis? Anybody?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So when you mentioned the individualized training, how much is that reliant on the athletes themselves managing that versus having a coach that's going to manage that?
You know what? That's a great question, and I'm going to tell you right. This is when I work with programs, when it fails, is because the coaches aren't engaged and it's left up to the athletes. The athletes cannot do this correctly. Straight out, tell you the truth. You know, it's interesting because the mindset of a tennis player versus the mindset of, let's say, an endurance athlete, because endurance athletes are like your marathon runners and distance runners. They will look at this data and actually use this data because they're interested in the science behind it. Most team sports don't care. But if you have a coach that cares, it makes a significant difference in the way this program is executed. What I would tell you is, from my experience, there's about 3 or 4 athletes on every team that would absolutely engage this by themselves. You don't need to motivate them. It's the rest that you need to motivate. And if you have a couple players that don't buy in and like, oh, this is crap, it's not going to do anything, it's not going to work in that team. It doesn't make sense. You're wasting the time, you're wasting your money. Don't even go there. So can anybody think of how this type of training helps tennis?
It would help you make sure you're staying within a certain or below a certain range to minimize fatigue during matches.
Right, and specific training would elicit what? What were you going to say in the back?
Well, since tennis is a unique sport where you have to be both explosive for a certain amount of time and have that recovery between points.
Recovery.
So over like 2 to 3 hours. So you kind of have
Endurance.
that aspect. Yeah.
Right. So the things that are vital for me in the work that I do is, how do we recover quickly in between points? How do we recover between sets? How do we last to the 3rd set and then maybe a tiebreaker? So we're talking about 2 different areas that I focus on specifically once I have this data, and then I set up a training prescription for the athletes to follow. And that goes back to what I said earlier. High stress, high recovery. And that means within the framework of the training sessions. In the intervals themselves, the way we look at intervals it's different when you base it on heart rate as opposed to basing it on time. Make sense? Understanding how to train the cardiovascular here it is, long sets, tiebreakers. That's the endurance element. So there's the 2 elements are fast recovery times in between points, and then endurance. Oops. Okay. The positives for using heart rate, it's easy to understand. It can be relatively inexpensive. I was telling the story to the last group. They were asking me like how I was doing it when I first started. I didn't have money to buy a heart rate monitor. I was broke, So I believed in this process. So picture this, you're riding 30, 35 miles an hour into a sprint, taking your heart rate by your hand, trying to look at your watch at the same time. Because that's what I was doing. You're like riding full speed and you're like, oh, and you're trying to stay on the bike and it's nuts. It's crazy, right? But it worked. And I started using it, and then finally saved up and did something smart and bought a real one. There's a rough correlation between heart rate and lactate threshold. This is very important. Do you guys understand what lactate threshold is? Who doesn't understand what lactate threshold is? So everybody's a genius in this room? I'm unbelievably blown away. So lactate threshold essentially is the barrier of performance. Can anyone describe what that feels like? Describe it.
Yeah, I mean, basically, right? You go and go and go.
Yeah, but how does it feel like? What does it feel like in your body?
Dead leg, like lack of coordination.
Right, okay, that's actually a good way. Because it's like, you're like, oh, I can't go anymore. That's when you've gone above your lactate threshold. What has to happen in order for you to start up again? Recover. Right, recover. Right? So, what I suggest to you about lactate threshold, the higher you push that towards the max heart rate, the bigger the performance area becomes. The longer, the faster, the harder, the stronger the athlete can perform. Does that make sense? So this lactate threshold is very, very important for the basis of the work that I do.
Correlations to the mental aspect, decision making.
Cognitive. Well, we didn't even talk about. Thank you. Like I didn't. I mean, this is goofy enough. But yes, cognition is better, right? Decision making is better later stages of the match, right? Tiebreakers, whatever. And then you could reach max cardiovascular output. In other words, you could train the heart to perform in a matter of a couple weeks. You don't necessarily see external effects, but if you track the data, like every morning, you'll start to see the resting heart rate going lower and lower and lower as fitness gets higher and higher. So we could see these changes, and they're mapped out by the heart. The heart is everything. It's everything. You can predict illness, is what we talked about, different types of stressors. Can you guys name any other stressors than physical stress that an athlete might encounter, especially a student athlete? Academics, exams. Lack of sleep. That's a good one, right? What about going out on Friday night, right? That's another one. Yeah, right. right. What about travel? Right? Travel stress. Your athletes travel a long distance and they're sitting in one space. Heart rate's going to go up if you're looking at it. So that gives you an idea how you need to adjust for that when you're finished traveling, wherever your destination is, right? And then this is a big thing, is this bottom one, level of accountability for the athletes, right? So the way I set up a program is the athletes send their heart rates through a group app. Everybody sees it, myself, trainers, AD, everybody sees it, right? But the teams that do exceptionally well report data. The teams that don't do well, in my opinion, that I've worked with, have one athlete will report, some don't. That's not if you can't send in your morning heart rate, if you can't take the time to take literally 20 seconds the most to send in your morning heart rate, that says a lot about your team. If you can't do it, then you're not really committed. And I don't want to work with players and coaches and teams that aren't really committed. You're either in or you're not. And the ones that are in do exceptionally well, right? The Vandy's, the NC States, those groups, right?
Sorry, how do you guys work around the privacy concern?
Well,
We can't ask them, hey, you have to.
it's optional. It's totally optional. And the programs and the athletes that see the value in it absolutely want to do it. Like, athletes will call me and say, hey, can you talk to our coach because we want to do it? And I said, no, I can't talk to your coach, but your coach can talk to me. Because I can't really go solicit like that. It's just not how I work anyway. Okay, so the process that I use is basically this right here, right? So I capture the heart rate data. We do periodic testing to measure if the training is actually working or not, right? Then we do the monitoring. In other words, the overnight monitoring, the daily monitoring. During training sessions, I monitor and assess everything, right? And then we plot the data out. And I'm going to show you examples of all this stuff. And then the assessing, and this is probably probably where I do really well in terms of with the coaches and interacting with them, because most coaches are relying on my assessment from years of experience of doing it. So here's the first set of data that I wanted to show you guys. This is a 22-week team average. This is a championship team that went on to win a championship. But the interesting thing is I want you to look at the red and the green. And in the very first week, the team average was 48.9, which is actually quite good, to be honest with you. But by the end of the season, their lowest point, and when they were peaking, was 37.4, which is insane as a team. Think about that. If you have 10 athletes on a team and they're all sub 40 heart rates overnight resting, it's going to be really hard to beat this team physically. You can beat them technically, but it's going to be really hard to beat them physically. And of course, they won the championship. It's in the data. You just need to look at it and just say, okay, yeah, this makes sense. Is there any questions on this before I change this? Anybody? Yeah.
You'll probably talk about it later. If you aren't, don't worry about it. But how do you capture the data? Like, how do you?
Okay, so great. No, that's great. We could talk about that. Any ideas on how I might capture you want to explain it, Raleigh?
Yeah, so with our guys, we actually had a variety. So we worked with this for 1 year, and essentially every morning the athlete sends in, athletes and the coaches, both my head coach and I were really into it as well, send in their resting heart rate, which for ours, we had the guys, we weren't able to buy them watches, so either guys who had their own watches, or you can take it just with your pulse here, but every morning it's basically sent in to the chat and then Paul will put it all over.
Right.
To a device.
No, and there's a reason for that. There is a reason why I don't like group send it. Two reasons are I want the athletes to understand what's going on in their bodies on a daily basis. Two, I want them to physically send it in to me because I physically write it in. So by the end of the season, I can tell you everybody's average. So right now I have 47 athletes that I work with. I could tell you each one of their averages. I want to know what their average is. They should know what their average is. This goes beyond the scope of just basic conditioning for tennis. This is something you could carry on once they graduate college and move on in life. These are markers that are very important. They can be used in a clinical sense.
What's the room for error? Meaning, if they miss a day out of the week, or 2 days out of the week, or 2 days out of the month, like at what point does the data become corrupted in a sense?
Well, it could become corrupted if it's not captured correctly, first and foremost.
I'm saying specifically if they miss it, like how many days can they miss before it still be functional?
The data can always be functional as long as the athlete's training. If the athlete is not training and not reporting, that's when it becomes a problem. And that can take like 5 to 6 days before there's actual physiological adjustments that would screw up the data. And then we'd have to work on retraining that athlete. So if they don't send it in, but they're still doing all the workouts, that usually doesn't affect it. Once you go 2 or 3 weeks out with no data, that'll never happen. Honestly, because I'm on the coaches if they miss 2 days. And I'm on the athletes if they miss 2 days. Because I hold them accountable. And then if they're just disinterested and don't want it, then they don't do the program, that's it. We don't need to work with them.
So obviously you have to push athletes to get better, right? So you have to push them harder, and then back off and stuff. And I was trying to look at the data here, and you can notice some peaks and some little.
Yeah, that happens every week.
So how do you manage that? And how do you know, say you have, say some weekends we'll have to play 3 matches 3 days in a row, right? So how do you prepare someone for that? Maybe the second day they're really exhausted, but you're okay, do I push them through this or do I not?
You push an athlete only when you have to.
Okay.
If it's tournament play and it's day to day and you don't have a choice, then you have no choice. If it's coming into a match, you have no choice if they're going to play.
Yeah.
Okay, so that put that aside. Everything else can be changed. In other words, training can be changed, that can be modified, intensity can change. So it just depends on the situation. And once you understand, once you start tracking this, you'll be able to see, I could probably push through this, or no, we should back off. Right? Let's go on to the next slide real quick. So this is looking at illnesses. All right, so this is a week. These are different athletes. One is illness, one is injury. This illness on this side was an individual athlete coming in to this week. Their average was 40.9, right? As we go through the week, you see it starts to increase. By the time it gets to 45, I'm talking to the coach. I'm like, okay, something's going on. I don't know what this is. We need to look at this and take it seriously. So they might back off on that particular athlete, which they did. The next day, it was 46. I'm like, get that student to student health. This was mono. That's what it looked like from a heart rate standpoint. This, anybody guess what this is? It jumps from 40 to 44. What did you say? Yeah, a version of it. That's COVID. That's COVID. What's going on? Did we miss a lunch or something? What's happening? Oh, is that what that is? All right. I have no idea. All I know is whatever we're doing in here, we should be over there. Right? That's what I think. I think we're in the wrong room. This is an example of a chronic injury. This happened to be a shoulder injury. It happened here where the data wasn't reported. He was hurt. So over time, you see that it starts to increase. It goes from 40 to 41 to 42, right? It's very subtle. What do you think is happening internally to the body when you see this? What is the body doing?
Inflammation.
Yeah. So he said inflammation, but the body is trying to repair itself. And you could actually see that. What if this athlete, let me ask you, let's see where you guys are at. I know this is asking a lot, but what if this athlete wasn't injured and you saw this pattern? What do you think?
I mean, my first thought with academics is that he's getting more and more stressed academically.
Or, put,
He's getting sick.
there's one other, wait, who said it? Or, there's overtraining. So it could be, this to your point, which is a real accurate assessment, she said not training. But it would go up faster. It would probably be in 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks, and it would go higher, right? I know that he's still doing something here, but it could be an overtraining scenario. And that's the thing about overtraining is by the time it's the end of the year, he might be at like 55, and then he's not going to be able to perform at all.
Does that also like signify like maybe they don't have the injury full blown yet, but it's brewing?
No, this was already, he was already injured. That was it. Like he could still work out, but he couldn't do anything upper body. Testing versus January testing. What happens prior to January in every college? Finals and Christmas, right. What usually happens when an athlete comes back after the holidays? Right. But how much out of shape? Or are they still in shape? In this particular case, he went from a 68 to 69 VO2 max. Do you know what VO2 max represents? You've heard of it, but do you know what it means? Anybody?
The rate at which oxygen is thrown away.
The amount of the volume of oxygen per liter per minute during performance. The bigger that is, the greater the athlete theoretically can perform. Doesn't mean they're going to win, but it's a good indication. Any idea, Nadal? Anyone know his VO2 max score? It's insane, I'm not going to lie. It's like an 80, which would put you up there with some of the most elite cyclists in the world. So he's already had a genetic gift to begin with, and then he just goes in and dominates tennis, right? What do you think the highest VO2 max score I ever registered, and you can't say it because you might know, that I registered ever from a tennis player, college tennis player? Take a guess.
72.
72.9. Yeah, Alexis from NC State a couple years back.
Coach's heart rates during like conference championship.
How about tracking my heart rate during conference championships? Because I'm just as nervous as the coaches are. It's harder for me to stand up there. I can't watch. Like I go nuts. I could not play this sport. It is too mentally challenging, and I am mentally challenged sometimes. So the next number becomes really important to understand if they actually did something over the break. that LT, that's lactate threshold. In this particular case, coming into the fall, their lactate threshold that we talked about earlier was 176. We usually want to see it come up, be the same, or just slightly below after Christmas break. We don't want to see it drop off significantly. He went up to 170, which was an indication that he actually did the work that he was supposed to do. The bigger number that I'm concerned with out of all these numbers is this right here, this recovery number. So in the fall, from max output during the test to 30-second recovery. Why 30 seconds? Why do I look at 30 seconds in tennis? Time in between points. Right. He dropped 18 beats. By the winter, he dropped 30 beats. If you could drop 30 beats in 30 seconds during a match, over the course of a match, how are you going to feel in the third set tiebreaker? Hell yeah, you bet. So this was a significant improvement. He did some really good work. The second one, we're looking at a female athlete, and she too went up, right? The interesting thing is this lactate threshold number, which actually went down. 5 beats isn't that big of a deal to me. I don't particularly care. But what this tells me is that she worked out, she played tennis during the break. She did not do specific cardiovascular training that would increase it. That's the only difference, because it still shows in the number, because she went from 31 beats to 35 beats. Think about that, 35 beats in 30 seconds. What do you think the highest drop I've ever seen in 30 seconds on a tennis player? 47 beats. 47 beats in 30 seconds. Think of the recovery time on that. There is a way to train the heart to do that. If you could do that more times, you're going to have the advantage if all factors are considered equal. Okay, moving on. This is an example of the break and what the, like Christmas break or holiday break, and one athlete that did something and one athlete that went out and partied. And we know this because I know what happened in both particular cases. But coming into the break, 41.3 on this athlete. By the time they came back, they were 31.8, that's resting heart rate. So they were improving throughout the course of the break. So that's setting them up for what happens in May. That's where this becomes important. We know that we don't have to retrain this athlete. And you want all your athletes to perform like this, theoretically. Do they do it? It's up to them, right? It's a different type of athlete. And this particular athlete was 49 beats, and they come back at almost 60 beats. You're in trouble. You're like, oh man, we got to start all over again. And you have to. And you have to literally train this athlete different than you would train the rest of the team. You're like, I just wasted my time. This is just a quick sample of overtraining and what we had talked about before. This goes back to what we were saying with you. You can see it goes up over time. It's not significant, but ultimately it becomes significant. The athlete doesn't even feel like anything has changed in their body, but pretty soon performance starts degrading. And then you have to go back and look. So when I work with teams, I'm always looking back 2 weeks. Every time I put data in, I always look back 2 weeks to see what the averages were, to see if this is building. So it's a way to track this, because you don't know. The last thing you want to do is come into a tournament after having a great season and then not be able to go through the tournament, right? You get knocked out right away because you were outplayed or something. So here is an actual example of coming off of a Friday match with another match on Sunday, and what happened to the individual athletes. So this athlete was up 6 beats. That's the morning or the night after a match, right? So the overnight. This athlete didn't play, 47. This athlete actually recovered. So they recovered within 24 hours. The next athlete was up 10. The other athlete was recovered. The other athlete didn't play. And then the other 3 were up. So most of the team was up. What would that tell you should do on that particular day after a match? What kind of training might you say, okay, we need to look at? Anybody?
Something like lower intensity?
Yeah, lower intensity for sure. You could still hit, you could still do drills, but just keep the intensity down. Because you want them 100% on Sunday, right? So that's a hard thing to kind of manage. But if you don't know this and you train them like you normally would train them, then there's a really good chance they're going to be really tired. And maybe they don't even get through the second set. Make sense?
How often again are the measures being taken?
Every day.
At night and morning?
No, at night. and then at night and during training sessions. But specific cardiovascular training sessions. I do some stuff where they're actually practicing on the court where I'll look at that data too, because I like to see patterns. We still haven't gotten to the point where we're allowed to actually track game data, but over the summer we can track game data, and when they're not, whatever.
Not wearing like chest monitors like soccer teams or something.
You could. Right now I think, what do you call it, paid an exuberant amount of money. Not Wahoo, Whoop. You guys know Whoop system? Yeah, they paid whatever tennis association millions of dollars because they'll let you wear a Whoop, but they won't let you wear any other heart rate monitor. And Whoop, for my bang for the buck, I don't think it's worth it, and it's not a slam against Whoop, and I'll explain why. But it's relatively inaccurate, especially when you're moving. Whoop is excellent for sleep tracking, but it's really expensive for sleep tracking. You could do it much cheaper. Excellent, best sleep tracker I've ever seen is a Whoop. During performance, not so much, because your wrist. Do you know the difference? So let's talk about this real quick. The difference between an optical sensor and an EKG? No? Anybody? You guys who has watches on that are heart measurements, right? You know what this flickering thing is in the back? Yeah, this is an optical sensor. An EKG is a chest strap, right? Or when you go to the hospital and they put the EKG on you, right? So what is the EKG measuring and what is this measuring? Because they're two different things. The EKG is measuring an electrical impulse across the heart that triggers the heart to beat. The optical sensor is measuring blood flow through the veins. So it's not actually measuring heart rate, it's measuring blood flow. So right there in itself, there's going to be a little bit of a difference. Now, if you're measuring it at the wrist, it's going to be relatively inaccurate. That's why if you're going to use an optical sensor, ideally, you want to put it up on the wrist or the forearm, right near the brachial artery, so it can actually read the data. And I've matched this up against, I have a 12-lead EKG system that I use at my place, and I matched it against it, and it's really close, like within a second or two of a beat. So up here it works very effectively. However, it has to be on tight, because if you're moving around a lot, it's going to slip, it's going to lose signal. So just be aware of that. So there's a difference. Sleep trackers are great at the wrist, and that's what we use in most of the programs that I work with. We use something on the wrist for a sleep tracker, but during training, we use an optical sensor on the forearm. Any other questions? All right, let's move on. So essentially, to sum things up, cardiovascular training is easily overlooked, underdeveloped, and oftentimes overtrained when they run too much. Here's something, as I told you, it's just sort of a general guideline for cardiovascular training. And one thing I want to talk is just about the flow of this. Monday is typically recovery, so you do something light or nothing at all, right? 2 could be an endurance. It depends on when you play matches. Wednesday, high intensity, and those two are interchangeable. Thursday is either recovery or really high intensity, just depending. And then if you're playing on Friday, that sort of a thing. So if you want to take a picture of that, you can go ahead. Right now we're done, because I know you guys are getting tired, and I don't want to bore you, because I might like the sound of my own voice, but that doesn't mean you guys like it. Any questions related to that? Yeah, go ahead.
How well can you differentiate between the lack of sleep, the stress from school,
Wow.
overtraining?
Yes, yes.
Almost all of those are in play every single day.
Yes, they are.
I can see my
Yes.
being like, no, I'm stressed from school, or oh yeah, I am injured. Like, well, which one?
Which one is it?
Yeah.
And that's part of why I have to know the teams so well, because we have to know who's being legitimate and who's not being legitimate. So, like, you guys are right there by Vandy. And I'm going to assume that your team takes education like Vandy does very seriously. Right. So they're usually, when they tell us it's an educational thing, like I'm stressed from studying, I tend to believe that. Yeah. However, you start to build a pattern over time by tracking the data. Without tracking the data, you have nothing to work with. As opposed, if you just simply do that, just that alone, that'll give you insight to, okay, this might be stress. They're out drinking, or they're tired from working out. Because you'll see a difference. Typically what I've seen, if they're stressed from the previous day's practice, it's usually 3 to 5 beats up, which is a good sign. That means they're actually got benefits from your practice. If it goes below, that's fine. That means they're fully recovered, and you might think about making your practices a little bit more difficult. But most of the time, it goes up to 3 beats. If it's like 5 to 7 beats, I mean, you gotta go, okay, what's going on? Like, we don't know what's happening. If it's 10 beats or above, it's almost 99% illness, almost 99. And you could see it immediately. You'd be like, oh, okay, right? Yeah.
How do you, regardless of the stressor, right, sleep, academics, fitness,
Yeah.
is your answer to all the higher heart rate
This is a great question. Go ahead.
to just slow down?
Yes. Well, your watch doesn't understand, right? In general, that's such a great question, because I work with a lot of teams. Will be like, oh, well, because the perception is it wasn't physical, therefore it doesn't count, is wrong. High stress is high stress, and you kind of have to treat it similarly, right? You know the difference between real physical stress and staying up late studying, right? You can work around that, but typically that's the rule, and it seems to work very well. So, yeah, as long as we're talking about an athlete first and foremost, and an athlete that is typically training on a daily basis, right, as opposed to just anybody else. So yes, that's the way I would approach it, and that's the way I have approached it. Now, when I give my feedback to the coaches, they don't have to follow it. It's just hey, look, this is something you might want to consider. And typically, when they don't consider it, things don't usually work out. I'm not saying nothing from nothing, but just yeah.
And during the practice, how are you measuring? Are you having them wear the monitors?
Now, what kind of practice are you talking about? Are you talking about on the court practice? We typically don't track them on the court. Some teams do. I will assess that just to see, because it's always nice to see what they're actually doing on court, because I could start to build separate profiles on each athlete. In fact, the profiles that I've been able to build, which if you use this data correctly, every team that I've ever worked with has a magic number, right? NC State women, it's 47. Anything at 47 beats or below is 100% victory rate because of full recovery. It's very strange. Vandy was 42 beats per minute when I worked with them when they went to the NCAA championship. So Paul Jubb was 39. There's a magic number that you can, so there's a lot you can infer. So once you talk about all these different stressors and you understand the numbers, you could start to fit them in with your team. And every athlete has a different profile, right? So it's not easy. This is a lot. It's easy because the data is easy to capture and that sort of thing, but there are a lot of layers here, right? And it's just, but it works. And if you could sift through that, and it takes time, but having some data, in my opinion, is better than not having anything at all, and you're just guessing all year long. Yeah, they look great. Yeah, that worked, or it didn't. You don't know unless you can back it up with some form of data. That's why, when I talk to the coaches, I never make up stuff, although as much as I'd like to make up stuff, I can't. But I could support everything I say with data. You could see it coming. And if David's out there, I'm not sure if he is, but he's going to talk in the next session, I think. And he'll tell you that. Yes, the data leads you in a certain direction, and when we've gone the opposite way, it hasn't worked out for us. So, food for that. Any other questions? Yeah, wait, go ahead.
How do you measure the overnight heart rate? Is it the first thing in the morning?
You could do it that way as long as you don't move. Now understand, if you do it that way, who has to usually pee in the morning when they get up? What is that going to do? It's going to raise your heart rate even before you get out of bed. So you have to count 1 or 2 beats if you do it like this in the morning. Or use an app, because you can use an app too, a finger app, where you can measure your heart rate off your phone. It's pretty cool. But normally we sleep with a tracker. The teams that I work with sleep with some form of a tracker on.
And then you do an average throughout the night, or do you take one number in the middle of the night?
For me, I look at the lowest point and how long they've held it. So I look at the whole night, and then that's what I put in to when I start setting up my graphs. Any other questions?
Yeah, 2 questions. One, so you basically need the number before they go to bed, then you take
No. I just get it overnight. I don't need a number before bed.
basically all you need is just the overnight number.
That's what
Overnight, that's what you need.
That's what I've learned seems to work the best.
Okay, so that's
It's interesting because with weights, I usually don't, they're never going to get their heart rate to that kind of an intensity unless they're doing specific high intensity circuit training. So weightlifting is fine, and it doesn't usually affect, although the strength and conditioning coach has access to the same numbers that I do. So we communicate with each other. So I give him an idea. Hey, you know what? I got to wrap up because... Oh, you did. Thank you, Dave. So if you have any questions, you could hang on, let me switch this real quick. Here's my number. Call me. Here's my email address. And I'm sorry we have to cut it short. I really apologize. Thanks, guys.